This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy. Bank Trust Departments. In the 1920s, most of the information in this book was common knowledge among informed people. Since that time, an iron curtain of silence has descended on the West. The way the censorship is managed is most interesting. Almost 45% of the total stock of corporations in the United States is held in trust at bank trust departments. The banks don't own these stocks. They don't keep the income from these stocks, but the banks vote these stocks. Without having to have a single dollar of their own money at risk, the banks of the United States vote the stock that they hold in trust for others. The traditional rule of thumb says that if an individual votes as much as 10% of a company's stock at a stockholders meeting, he is usually considered to have control or near control of that company. The trust departments of America vote 4 times this amount. A full 30% of all the stock in the country is voted from the trust departments of the banks of New York. It is true that some trusts reserve voting rights to themselves, but most leave this to the banks. The fact is, the New York banks control American industry by voting the stock held in their trust. In this way, the banks control American industry and how America's industry spends its money. This allows them to control the rest of America. This is why industry-endowed colleges employ only liberal teachers, why only certain charities get money, why there is no difference between the political parties, and why every word written by newspaper chains or spoken by their TV media is filtered first. In 1928, most corporations had no debt at all. Today, with the control of corporations in the hands of lending institutions, corporate debt is predictably large. Here is the debt of a few of America's corporations. AMR Corp has long-term debt of $1.5 billion. Duke Power has long-term debt of $2.7 billion. Southern California Edison has $4.1 billion. And Detroit Edison has long-term debt of $3.5 billion. Banks are in the business of lending money. American banks control American corporations. American corporations must borrow money when their masters tell them to. Human nature is self-serving. An investigation could quickly show if the corporations borrow from the same banks that control them. This is important. If corporations are forced into bankruptcy because of the huge amounts of money controlling banks who require them to borrow, a jury may find these banks responsible. The responsible banks could then be found liable for losses incurred. America's corporations have been treated like cows. Once the halter has been placed about their necks by bank trust departments, they have been fattened to giant size by massive feedings of debt. Then the interest is milked from them. As a result, a large part of America's industry is oversized, overstaffed, and overmortgaged. This does not benefit the corporations or the stockholders if it results in the corporation's bankruptcy. It does benefit the banks that lent the money. Corporations build incredibly expensive skyscraper offices in New York, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. It is assumed by many that these business blunders were made so that the controlling bank could profit from the loans. The next Penn Central type bankruptcy may force the answer to this question in court. The few independent family-owned newspapers, TV, and radio stations stay in business by advertising. Corporations do the advertising. The corporations that do the advertising are controlled by bank trust departments. The media please the banks, or they don't get advertising. If they don't get advertising, they go out of business. It's that simple. This has led to the rapid growth of alternate media newsletters, small newspapers, books such as this one, and periodicals. People are attempting to gain news not present in today's media, since most of today's media carries corporate advertising and has been bought while trying to keep that advertising. In a political contest, corporate donations and media coverage tend to go to the candidate who pleases the New York banks. It is virtually impossible to reach the top rungs of the political ladder without going by this rule. Frankly, the banking industry would be foolish to support their enemies. For this reason, it must be assumed that any candidate endorsed by the media is also pleasing the New York money interests. The banks control the nation's corporations through their ability to vote stock held in trust. The corporations controlled by the banks in turn control politicians, colleges, and media with their donations and advertising. These in turn reflect the opinions of their masters. This results in liberal politicians, liberal colleges, and liberal media being against almost everything Christian America is for. Banks and bank stocks. The foregoing shows how usury banks have grown, through good times and bad. It would seem that this is the one foolproof investment that will guarantee a profit in the days ahead. It is easy to sit back and dream about becoming one of the rulers of the West by buying into one of the stronger New York banks and hoping it will emerge the grand winner in the bank-eat-bank period ahead. Don't count on it. The odds may be worse than you think for the following reasons. 1. A fog of uncertainty will fall over the entire banking industry in the days ahead as farmers, corporations, and countries default. 2. It is virtually impossible to know which bank owns strong loans and which owns weak ones. Therefore, it is virtually impossible to guess the survivors. 3. The greatest cloud over the interest banking industry has just now begun to rise and overshadow all else. Its name? Reform. Solutions: reform or conquest. In the past, to alleviate the suffering of their nations caused by interest banking, rulers in Greece and Rome in the ancient world, and Austria, France, Portugal, and many other nations in the modern world have been forced to nullify debt. This is the state acting in a financial crisis. The traditional position of the Christian Church on the subject has been to condemn usury banking. The recent position of Pastor Sheldon Emery is typical. Quote, "And thou shalt number 49 years, then shalt the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound, and ye shall return every man unto his possession." End quote. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 8 to 10. Quote, "This is a year of cancellation of all debts and the return of all foreclosed properties to the rightful owner. This is what can, what must, and what will be done in America. Debts such as mortgages on homes, farms, businesses, automobile loans, the federal debt, and all state and local bonded debts are all illegal under God's law, and since they have been obtained by the moneylenders through violations of the law and Constitution of the United States, they must be canceled." End quote. Others quote Revelation chapter 18, verses 2 to 18. "Babylon the Great is fallen. She shall be utterly burned with fire, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships cried when they saw the smoke of her burning." Certain Christian leaders are calling New York, the center of world usury, the, quote, harlot, as if she were modern-day Babylon, and the above scriptures were to be fulfilled tomorrow. These words, these opinions, have not been spoken with such fervor for generations. Not caring whose toes they step on, more and more ministers are raising the banner against interest. Worsening economic conditions could quickly mushroom it into a tidal wave. This is a force transcending and sweeping away economic theory. It has historical precedent. The West outlawed interest for over 1,000 years and instituted interest-free banking in obedience to their religious teachings and to protect unsophisticated debtors. The present rising demand to return to that form of banking was triggered by the resurrection of Arab interest-free banks, which are presently in operation. If neither the state nor the Christian Church causes the demise of interest banks in the days ahead, the time will inevitably arrive when there will be only 2 superbanks left. One will take over the other. Since the borrower is servant to the lender, whoever rules the surviving bank will also rule the world. African colonization. In 1921, the unemployment rate reached 22%. Africans had the highest rates. Many were desolate and hungry. Word was received from their kinsmen in Africa, who had been repatriated more than 100 years before, that there was plenty to eat there. Quote, "Back to Africa" movements sprang up overnight. The largest and best known was the Universal N Improvement Association. This 6 million member organization was founded by a remarkable black genius named Marcus Garvey. Garvey's organization spread over North, Central, and South America. He distrusted Caucasians, with good reason. White liberals did everything in their power to stop African Americans from leaving America. Marcus Garvey despaired of getting help. He decided to go it alone. He sold shares of stock to buy ships for his all-black Star Line. An all-white court deemed Garvey's efforts visionary, impractical, and partaking of fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal prison. When he was released, he was deported as an undesirable alien. As soon as the Garvey movement was put down, another one arose, the peace movement of Ethiopia. In 1933, a petition signed by 2 million blacks was sent to President Roosevelt requesting that their relief money be put in a fund to help them to return to Africa. Roosevelt had been put into the White House by the Northeast lending interests. His job was to force Americans to borrow money into existence to get the country out of the Depression and also turn a profit for the banks. He couldn't allow millions of debt-free potential borrowers to leave. He refused to see the black delegation with the petition. In 1939, Senator Bilbo introduced the Great Liberal Bill, supported with a petition signed by 2.5 million blacks. The bill was quietly sent to the committee to die. Mrs. Gordon, president of the peace movement of Ethiopia, spoke strongly against the attempt to kill the bill. She was charged under the sedition laws and jailed for 2 years in a federal prison. In 1949, Senator Langer presented the Langer Bill to aid blacks who wished to return to Africa. It was backed by many black organizations. It was referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations and never heard from again. As discussed earlier, in a usury society, slaves are freed to borrow money into existence, and for no other reason. The ex-slave has freedom only to borrow money into existence. He does not have the freedom to remove himself from the society. The only hope the black has of returning to his ancestral home is for the return of the Christian economic system. If once the system of interest is done away with, the compelling need to keep the African Americans in America will also be done away with. There would be no more need for equal employment to make sure the African American has sufficient funds to float large loans. The need for equal voting rights will die when the need for minority housing dies. The block-busting laws will die when the need to push whites into new areas to borrow money for new houses dies. Forced race mixing in schools and neighborhoods will live only so long as usury lives. When it dies, African Americans will be able to return to Africa if they choose. There will be no reason to stop them. 1923. A total of 18,718 businesses failed. My father, Dr. John H. Hoskins, was a physician in Hazard, Kentucky. His patients were miners. Coal prices peaked in 1920 and started down. He had plenty of patients, but the patients had no money. Dad couldn't meet expenses and lost his hospital. There was a radical change in the nation's economy between 1920 and 1923. In the 1920s, it was the banks that sold most of the stocks traded on the exchanges, not the brokerage firms. They sold stocks on 10% margin and lent 90% at high rates of interest. Fantastic sums were borrowed for this purpose. 1925. Washington State municipal default started, including Tacoma and Spokane. 2% of the banks failed. The stock market climbed. 1926. Mussolini regulated pimps, whores, and usurers to a fixed place of business. 55 municipalities went into default in Washington State. 2% more of the banks failed. The stock market was still strong. 1927. 4% of the banks fail. Stock market soars. Florida defaults started again, joined by Arkansas municipal defaults. Since the subject of municipal defaults is of more than passing interest to a number of readers, Portfolios Investment Advisory has consented to the publication of Issue 94 on municipal bonds in the next chapter.